Hello, I'm John Feldt, and this is the weekly water outlook for the Midwest for April 28th, 2013. Well, here's the precipitation that fell across the Midwest last week. Areas in yellow received the most rain, and that extended from southeast Kansas across parts of southern Missouri up across Illinois and Indiana. That was at least 2 inches of rain, a very soaking rain in those areas. But there's also some significant precipitation in the parts of the upper Midwest. The areas of green were between a half inch and up to an inch of rain. And you can see parts of southeast Nebraska into Iowa received significant precipitation as well over the last week. Now, if we look at percent of normal, you can see despite that rain, it looks like much of the Midwest, probably a majority, is still below normal for the week, and those are those areas of red. Especially the far upper Midwest, North Dakota is well below normal precipitation for the last week. The most obvious trend here you can see is the areas of blue, and that's above normal precipitation. That's that area I mentioned over Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. And then pushing across parts of Kentucky and Tennessee, that was by far the heaviest rainfall over the last 7 days. Now, I thought I'd sort of step back here and look at precipitation anomalies, either wet or dry, over periods of the past 15 days, 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days. I think what I wanted to show here is sometimes you see precipitation trends that are more in the short term, say over the last 15 days. But then as you go out further, another pattern, such as drought, shows up. But I did want to show you here, this is the last 15 days, and you can definitely see this pattern in this region right here that has been very wet. You also see that over the 30-day pattern and 60 days and actually 90 days. So if we look at 90 days, the longer term, you really do see this pattern from a large part of Missouri, parts of most of Iowa, especially the eastern part, much of it, Illinois, smaller part of Indiana, and then up into the Great Lakes. That's been a very active, wet area. And then I also think it's important to point out when you look at these longer term trends, the fact that there's a very abrupt line here that divides above normal precipitation to near normal. But anyway, that's also fairly significant that parts of the Dakotas, Nebraska, when we look at this longer term, the 90-day trend, the white area there is normal. So in those areas it started out very dry. There's been some improvement, and in many cases significant improvement in those regions as well. So when we look at soil moisture in the top 2 meters of the soil profile, areas in green are wet, and we're getting into those very dark shades of green, and that's indicating that we're getting to the point that we're getting some upper soil saturation. Grounds are getting very soggy in those areas of dark green. And then as we go through that transition band, here's this transition right here, and then we get into very dry soils over western parts of the Midwest. So like I said, there's a very abrupt transition right now where in some areas here we could be talking about soggy soils delaying spring planting. Over here we're looking at very dry soils, so it's very high degree of variability exists across the Midwest at this time. Now, if we look at the calculated soil moisture anomalies, these are percentiles, and what we see here, again, very clearly in green, those are the areas most vulnerable to those saturated upper soils. And like I've shown in the last couple images, from Missouri, large parts of Illinois, up into parts of Wisconsin and Michigan, and another area of Indiana right now are the highest percentiles. Now, we're definitely in the peak of flood season, and I wanted to point out that we have 2 floods going on, 2 flood events. One in the upper Midwest, and that's spring snowmelt, parts of the Red River, areas that lots of times do get that kind of flooding. So that's one event. And then we have the other one that occurred due to the heavier rainfall over the last several weeks to last month, and the Illinois River, Mississippi River, and their tributaries, also moderate and major flooding in many areas. So it's been a very significant flood event in parts of Missouri, Illinois, and Iowa, and then also in the upper Midwest. And this is probably going to be the defining spring flood event in these 2 areas because very soon we'll have the green up and that risk will pass and will melt the snow in the upper Midwest. Now, speaking of snow, This has been sort of a persistently cold or cooler than normal spring over many areas, and we're still getting snow very late in the season. I did want to point out that there was some snow over Kansas, Colorado, and the upper Midwest over the last week, and significant in a few spots. But what we see this time of year is that snow often melts very quickly, and there's very little snow on the ground right at the current time. I did want to sort of point out here, this is the outline of the snowpack. And this yellow here is the melt rate, and it's melting every day. So that's why we're getting that spring snow melt flooding over parts of the Red River of the north. Okay, so from time to time I show this image. It's how much precipitation is needed to bring the Palmer Drought Index to a neutral range. And just sort of a quick and dirty way to look at soil moisture and drought conditions. And what we see here is, generally speaking, we've returned to neutral conditions, if not too wet in spots over most of Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri on east. But we're still looking at about 3 to 6 inches of rain needed in Nebraska, and about an inch or two, maybe 3 in Kansas to get us back up to neutral. I say over many of my briefings and talks that doesn't mean we need that all at once. It's just over the next month or so, if we could get normal precipitation over Nebraska and Kansas, that could bring a very significant improvement over those areas as well. Okay, so here's the big picture for this upcoming week. Bit of a complex jet stream pattern. The green arrow there is early this week, and due to that positive Arctic oscillation, the jet stream has pulled up to the north. It's fairly far north. And then by late in the week, very interesting pattern here, the jet stream was going to dip south again, and we're going to actually get a closed low aloft. And whenever I see a closed low aloft, what you tend to think are cooler temperatures and showery, rainy, and maybe even snowy weather this time of year. So I think just looking at that type of pattern, what we're going to see is probably getting into sort of a dreary type pattern with occasional showers once we settle into that in the middle and latter part of this week. So here's your precipitation outlook for the next 5 days. And the heaviest rain amounts in Iowa, rain and snow I should say, are under that upper low. And not going to be a whole lot of energy, but there will be enough under the upper low, enough upper lift to produce rain and snow. It's going to be enough cold air to be snow in spots and rain in other spots over the Midwest. But you can see 3 inches of rain, which is going to be very significant in that area. That you might remember, I just showed that was sort of a neutral condition, so it's going to get fairly soggy. Looking at Nebraska, it doesn't work all that far west right now, but that half inch or so over Nebraska will definitely be welcome, and not nearly as much over the Dakotas and the upper Midwest. So soil moisture forecast changes here correspond to that precipitation forecast, and you can see that it does look like soil moistures will become wetter from parts of Kansas, small parts of Nebraska, but mainly Iowa over the next week. Now, I thought I'd look out a little bit further ahead. I know there's a lot of images here to take in, and I'll try to sort of talk your way through them. But on the left is week 1 and week 2. This is temperature on this side, and this is precipitation. I'm just going to point out some of the climate models the major trends are showing. So for temperature, blues are colder than normal temperatures, and this week a very strong signal of cooler than normal readings over most of the Midwest. And then in week 2, a little bit hard to say here, but it still looks like we're looking at cooler than normal temperatures over most of the Midwest. Maybe way up in the upper Midwest, a little bit warmer, but still I think we're trending towards cooler weather. Now, if we look at precipitation, we can see the outline of this week's rainfall. And then next week, it looks like a very strong dry pattern setting up. Eastern parts of the Midwest could be wet, but it looks like right in the core of the Midwest, it looks like it's going to be fairly dry. And even further out, I thought I'd show you these climate models for weeks 3 and 4. And there's no real strong prevailing trend one way or the other. You can see that there's not a strong core of either dry or wet. So I think I almost have to call that, as far as precipitation, most likely maybe closer to normal. But I don't see necessarily a continuation of this really wet trend for areas that have been wet. And maybe some precipitation over areas that have been dry. Probably not going to change the pattern real strong one way or the other. So the takeaway points from this week's briefing: a major flood event over the Midwest continues. Crests are working their way downstream. Most spots have seen the crest, and river levels will remain high for some time. With the upper low developing, looks like storms, showers, rain, and snow with cooler temperatures, and a continued increase in soil moisture, especially over Iowa. And I hope I've answered all your questions. If not, you can always email me. I'd be glad to help you out. You can reach me at john@bluewateroutlook.com. And I will be issuing my newsletter later this week talking about some of the bigger trends that are affecting the weather and water. And I will be issuing another briefing next week, and thank you for listening.